My name is David Keller. I love doing philosophy, especially thinking about ethics. As such, I have written and taped a series of short lectures on ethics aimed at college students or anyone interested in studying ethical theory in the Western intellectual tradition. I especially hope to show how the study of philosophical ethics is directly pertinent to everyday life, in your personal relationships, in your job, and as a citizen in a democracy. Most importantly, though, I hope to show how studying ethics is a whole lot of fun. First, let's define ethics. In philosophy, we define ethics as the philosophical study of morality. Now, there's several important things to notice in this definition. One is that in philosophy, ethics and morality are not directly equivalent. In everyday conversation, we often use the terms interchangeably, but in philosophy, we make a distinction between the two. Let's define morality in greater precision. Morality, as I define it, is the behavior of making moral judgments or value judgments regarding how best to live one's life. This presupposes that each one of us, as moral agents, has free will. In other words, morality denies determinism, the determinism that is common to the psychology of Sigmund Freud, for example. Morality presupposes that we are free agents capable of making value judgments about how best to live our lives, and that we're not causal machines. Value judgments differ from ordinary judgments of preference, such as the spiciness of your food or the color of your clothing. These, the value judgments of morality differ from judgments of mere preference because they include conceptions of goodness and conceptions of rightness, and they presuppose a class of beings worthy of moral considerability, and morality also presupposes a concept of virtue. Now, consider goodness for a moment. All moral judgments presuppose some conception of a highest moral good. This could be obedience to God. It could be acting in accordance to duty. It could be realizing one's individual potential. It could be affirming relationships with one another based on a care and empathy. It could also be maximizing a collective happiness. We all live our lives in accordance to one or more of these conceptions of goodness. Moral judgments also presuppose a class of beings worthy of moral considerability. This is what I mean. In the Western intellectual tradition, ethics has typically focused on human beings and human beings only as those beings worthy of moral considerability. But it also, but beings worthy of moral considerability also could be beings worthy of, capable of suffering, for example. The higher mammals, the primates, and dogs and cats and goats, and beings that have a high degree of sentience, for example. Some philosophers have argued that all living beings are worthy of moral considerability, just not human beings and just not animals capable of suffering. Some philosophers have gone so far as to argue that entire ecosystems are worthy of moral considerability. In all of these examples, we have different notions of a class of beings worthy of moral considerability, ranging from a very small class of beings, human beings, expanding outward to entire ecosystems. The point being, in ethics, in moral philosophy, there are different conceptions of what types of beings count in moral calculations. Moral judgments also presuppose virtue, that we as moral agents are capable of affirming moral goodness by having virtuous character. Now let's turn for a moment and consider the relationship of morality to human nature. The proclivity or the propensity to make moral judgments, I argue, is built into human nature, into the very constitution of our being. One wondrous characteristic which distinguishes us from other animals is this capacity to make moral judgments. The German philosopher Immanuel Kant wrote, "Two things fill the mind with ever new and increasing admiration and reverence. The more often and more steadily one reflects upon them, the starry heavens above me and the moral law within me." Here Immanuel Kant is affirming the fact that there is something about making moral judgments, making value judgments about how best to live our lives that is intrinsic to us as human beings, and it is part of what makes us human. We, in fact, cannot refrain, as hard as we might try, from making moral judgments. Imagine that tomorrow morning you wake up and laying in bed, you decide, I am not going to make any value judgments today. I am not going to make any moral judgments. I'm not going to judge the character of my friends and my family. I'm not going to judge the actions of strangers. I'm going to be completely amoral today in the way I live my life. I guarantee that you will fail by noon. By lunchtime, you will have judged the character of your friends, your family, your peers, your colleagues, and even strangers. In fact, as human beings, it is impossible for us not to make moral judgments. The French philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre wrote on this topic, "In one sense, choice is possible, but what is not possible is not to choose. I can always choose, but I ought to know that if I do not choose, I am still choosing." What Sartre is saying here is, if you choose not to make any moral judgments, if you choose to not make any value judgments, you are still choosing, and hence you have still made a moral judgment. The lesson here is that as much as we may not like it, we are saddled with the responsibility as human beings to make moral judgments about the character and actions of our fellow beings. It is part of what it means to be human. This saddles us with a huge responsibility. With the capacity to make moral judgments comes the responsibility to those beings worthy of moral consideration. So here, the fact that we cannot escape making moral judgments brings us back to the topic of what beings are worthy of moral considerability, of moral consideration, and the fact that we have duties, we have some kind of moral responsibility to those beings that demand our respect. This means that we have to somehow decide, come up with some criterion by which we distinguish beings worthy of moral consideration from beings not. Imagine that you are building a sidewalk from your front door to the street. And you need to decide whether to use sandstone or limestone. The stone is going to be cut, dramatically altered in its physical constitution. But choosing the kind of stone to use, whether it's sandstone or limestone, is not a moral judgment. Why? Because the sandstone and the limestone are not beings worthy of moral considerability, of moral consideration. If a being is worthy of moral consideration, we have the responsibility as moral agents to not incur harm or to even help. Suppose you are going to visit your elderly grandmother. Your elderly grandmother has a lot of time to think about her grandchildren, and as such, she worries a great deal about them and their lives and whether they're happy and whether they're achieving their goals. And you realize that if you instill any seed of worry in your grandmother's mind, she is going to spend hours and days and weeks worrying about you and your life. The best possible thing for your grandmother would be to hear from you that your life is going great. It couldn't be better. And it would be best if you did not reveal your doubts about graduate school, or your doubts about medical school, or your rocky, turbulent relationship with your boyfriend or your girlfriend, or your mounting credit card debt. Your grandmother is the kind of being that is capable of being harmed or helped by your actions. Your grandmother is worthy of moral considerability in fundamental, significant ways that the sandstone or the limestone is not. You, with regard to your grandmother, and unlike the situation about making the stone walkway from the front door to the street, you're in a moral situation. You need to decide whether to tell your grandmother with full disclosure the problems in your life, or whether to maybe not lie, but not be completely forthright with the truth, because your actions can affect her well-being. You're in a moral situation. You have to decide how best to live your life as a moral agent, what decision is best for your grandmother and you as a moral agent. Most situations as moral agents that we confront in our daily lives are of this nature. They're tough moral problems. There is another class of moral problems that philosophers call dilemmas. And these are much more pointed in the conflict and the decisions that you have to make. A dilemma is a situation in which you have two mutually exclusive moral duties or moral responsibilities that are not both actualizable. You cannot accomplish one as well as the other. If you do one thing, you automatically fail at doing the other. That's an ethical dilemma. To illustrate an ethical dilemma, imagine a nation at war. An enemy has captured both a high-ranking military officer and a civilian. The high-ranking military officer knows the location of a nuclear-armed submarine which, when used, could turn the tide of the war, resulting in defeat of the enemy and victory for the captured officer's country. The enemy also has captured a civilian of the same nationality as the officer. And the enemy threatens to torture the civilian in the most gruesome way possible, imaginable, unless the officer discloses the location of the nuclear submarine. The officer is in a dilemma. The officer presumably has a responsibility not to just the civilian of his or her own country, but to the citizens back home that might be attacked by the enemy unless the nuclear submarine is used. The officer cannot actualize both his or her duty to the civilian and the citizens back home. The officer is in a dilemma. This is a much more pointed situation about tough moral situations where it's clear what to do, but difficult, like a politician admitting in public that he or she has done something embarrassing. The military officer faces a dilemma because both duties are not fulfillable. Now, so by way of review, we have decided that ethics is the philosophical study of morality. Morality is some sort of behavior that is embedded in the human constitution, that morality involves making value judgments about how best to live one's life, and that these kinds of value judgments differ from judgments of ordinary preference, which are not moral judgments. Now, as a moral agent stumbling through your everyday life, as I have argued, you are going to have to make moral judgments one way or another. There are different ways of making moral judgments. One way is to simply flip a coin. Heads, tell grandma the truth. Tails, do not engage in full disclosure about your life. Or you could try for a mystical experience. You could go out into the wilderness, into the desert, dance around a fire, fast, and hope for some kind of a vision. You could also use your gut instincts, which is what many of us do much of the time. Just react without thinking in a situation using intuition and gut instinct. More commonly, you could employ some kind of religious faith. You could try to determine what religious authority, be that scripture or religious leaders, would have to say about the situation that you're in. Or you could employ reason, the tools of rationality. As I will argue in the next lecture, this is the method of ethics. The last two options, the use of faith and the use of reason, are distinctive human traits and the two primary sources of moral insight. As such, let's look closer at the relationship between faith and reason. Plato, 25 centuries ago, posed the question in the person of Socrates about the relationship of religion and ethics. Plato wrote through the person of Socrates in a dialogue called the Euthyphro. Socrates asked the question, is something good because the gods will it, or do the gods will it because it is good? There is a huge difference. Either actions are wrong only because of a divine intentionality, or actions are wrong independently of any divine will in and of themselves. In other words, either ethics is grounded only in a supernatural being or beings, or there are separate grounds for determining whether things are right or wrong. For example, is torturing babies wrong only because of a divine mandate against torturing babies, or is torturing babies wrong in and of itself, independently of divine will? And it just might happen that divine will is consistent with a mandate against torturing babies, but is not the reason why torturing babies is wrong morally. One of the most prominent theories in the Western intellectual tradition, divine command theory, represents the former alternative. That is, all morality is grounded in religion. The Ten Commandments is one example of divine command theory. That is, that certain prohibitions and certain mandates on human action derive their authority from divine will. On divine command theory, there would be no morality without God. Interestingly, though, the Bible itself contradicts divine command theory. In Genesis chapter 3, verses 5 and 22, we learn that moral awareness was brought about by eating the forbidden fruit of the tree of knowledge, and that this knowledge is passed down from generation to generation. If this is the case, that means that moral awareness, our moral consciousness, is a natural phenomenon, not supernatural. In other words, something about moral awareness, moral consciousness, that thing that is embedded into human nature, derives itself from our natural constitution, from the natural world, not a supernatural source. In that sense, divine command theory is not an adequate representation or an adequate explanation of our moral capacities. A much more promising connection between religion and reason in the Western intellectual tradition is known as natural law theory. This is the theory described by prominent Catholic theologians such as St. Thomas Aquinas. The assumption of natural law theory is that God gave us reason for a reason, and that reason is to make moral judgments correctly. The purpose on this interpretation of the connection between ethics and religion is that the purpose of reason is to interpret divine will within the context of the human condition and act appropriately. If, using reason, a human action, like the use of violence, is consistent with divine will, it is ethical. If it is not, it is unethical. In this way, using the model of natural law theory, moral judgments inspired by faith employ the tools of reason, but can never run contrary to reason. So we've seen how in the Western intellectual tradition there are many points of contact between religion and ethics, between faith and reason, but they are not coextensive. There's some difference between the approach to making moral judgments based on faith and the approach to making moral judgments based on reason. And we will flesh out these nuances in much greater detail in the next lecture. Before we move on to the next lecture, we should pay a little attention to the connection between ethics and law. A common misconception is that ethics and the law are coextensive, that if something is illegal, it is unethical, and if something is unethical, it must be illegal. This, of course, can be proven to be false through many counter instances, such as slavery, the inability of women to vote in the Western tradition, and other examples. If ethics and law were coextensive, then the law would never be unethical. But that is proven to be false through the course of human history. Sometimes we, as citizens, must push for legal changes because the law is unethical. And this, of course, is the foundation of the civil disobedience of Mahatma Gandhi and Martin Luther King and Henry David Thoreau. The idea that because law and ethics do not perfectly integrate, sometimes we have to push the limits of the law to improve the ethics of the law. So, in this short lecture today, we have decided that ethics is the philosophical study of morality, and that morality is based in the human condition, in our human constitution, and as much as we may not like or enjoy or want the responsibility of being moral agents, we cannot avoid it. And therefore, we have to make moral judgments in one way or another. We can guess, we can flip a coin, we can go for mystical experience, we can defer to religious authority, or we can use the tools of reason. Using the tools of reason to make moral judgments is the method of ethics, and that will be the starting point of the next lecture. Thank you.